years ago, I was allowed to become a hate figure in the community following the disastrous launch of Total War Rome 2 at great personal cost. I was widely blamed for the problems with the game and was assumed by many to have been fired for incompetence. The truth is that I led the effort to fix the game and fought behind the scenes for changes to production and design so that it would never happen again, and quit the company when it became clear that leadership was going to keep repeating the same mistakes. Who is this mystery person that writes it? It's this guy. Remember this guy?
In Rome 2, we have invested more resources into improving the battlefield AI than I think we have in any Total War game to date.
Julian McKinley coming through to set the record straight on their part 10 years later. This is perhaps one of the biggest bombshells ever dropped on Creative Assembly, not just for the launch of Rome 2, but as a company. The statement starts going in depth about the reception of Rome 2 as a game, how it was a disaster, and where we'll get onto later in the video exactly why and what behind the scenes is like at CA. This is huge. 15,000 words talking about that interview that we all seen, Rome 2's mismanagement and the inside leadership at Creative Assembly. So boy, you better strap in for this one. I might want to add, these are in the words of Julian, one ex-developer from Creative Assembly. This does not mean it is fact, but is an interesting insight to their personal experience at Creative Assembly as a company. It alleges that CA found it convenient that most of Rome 2's issues were down to the AI coding, which was Julian's main role. The community backlash when Rome 2 released was at him as an individual, and it gave a scapegoat to the company as a whole who didn't adequately accept blame for Rome 2's disaster launch, maybe letting directional hate stay on one person without putting the record straight. He also mentions a similar thing happened in Empire. When that was a disastrous launch, Creative Assembly let go of a lead AI programmer and made a statement about it, almost as if to say, it was this guy, but now we're going to be the ones that fix things. Let's talk about that Rally Point interview. He's referring to this infamous one.
Fixing bugs, polishing and iterating on what we've had previously.
I think the way most people look at it, here's a developer who's working on the game and therefore has all the inside information. So then when it comes out and is completely broken, he must have known that everything he was saying wasn't true. I suppose that's how the situation looked from the outside, but the truth is at this point I gave the interview, I didn't know what we were going to ship. I think people who don't work in games will really be surprised to learn that it's quite possible to work on a project like this and even a couple months from launch not really have a clear idea at all at what the final game is going to look like. Okay, that's a quote from this statement, and I'm not entirely convinced by this personally. I understand that there may be a state and the way that games are promoted in the modern day, or at least in 2013 when Rome 2 came out, but that definitely exposes a flaw in the system of hyping games up in a way before they have any real proof that has been established for features. For me, I don't think it's an excuse to just say, that's how it was done in the past. That's not how it should ever be done. He then goes on to say, when I worked at the company, Total War games usually only came together in the final weeks and months prior to launch. In my own opinion, is actually very different to now, because these days Total War games don't even get ready on their release. Oh god. Julian goes on to say, the confidence that he had in this interview, you know, the one where he shielded the AI very, very hard, came from the fact that it had performed well, the AI we're talking about, in controlled environments, but it hadn't been contested in organic gameplay. You know, the way that every human on Earth who paid for the game would be playing the game. Another fatal flaw here. He seems to go as far as to say that Rome 2 was unplayable during the entirety of its development cycle. The interview with Rally Point was important though. As stated here, Julian was not leading the team in any way. He even calls himself a low-level programmer later within this blog post. So it's very clear that everybody got the impression that he was the leader, the AI programmer that led all the decisions. So he was the one to blame when it didn't go right. I was rarely included in high-level decision-making and was typically not even invited to meetings where important production or creative decisions were made. Many of the management decisions that impacted the project were well outside my remit, and I relied heavily on communication from leadership to understand the state and the direction of the project. Which, by the way, I'm sorry, this is a complete lack of professionalism from Creative Assembly themselves. Where is their PR team at this point? Later in this blog post, they do mention before Rome 2, there wasn't too much of a PR team and they had a smaller team when this game came out because it was going to be so big. Why aren't they the ones doing these interviews? Where is the constructive and well thought out reveals, information, and features that are being promoted? Why are the low-level programmers, in Julian's own words, conducting interviews of this stature? Okay, he does mention that this interview was not supposed to be seen by many people, but it's in the public. And of course, it was then later used in videos like Angry Joe's very famous review that was seen by millions. Time and time again, we've seen this happen. Remember Sean Murray? Admittedly, No Man's Sky was his game. He was the founder of this, but he wasn't, once again, in PR. He was just a guy with an idea and had coding talent. But he was the one that did all the interviews, promised a load of things with a lack of evidence and communication, and absolutely ruined that game's launch when No Man's Sky eventually came out. And it honestly looks like this is almost the exact same thing that happened with Rome 2. A low-level programmer who isn't trained in PR, that doesn't have the wider picture of the game, is excited to promote the things that they've been working on and want to happen within the game, because Total War and Creative Assembly's PR is nowhere to be seen here. It then goes on to speak about QA testers and departments failing to report on why they haven't completed tasks in time. They were given things to do, they couldn't complete them, but they never told anybody else. A complete communication breakdown. These things were then promoted as features that weren't possible. I think it's clear, by the way, that I'm bringing out the most important parts of this statement with the appropriate information. But once again, this was 15,000 words, so please click the link in the description to go and read it all yourself. But I wanted to include this part for Julian's sake. While I never meant to mislead anyone, it's clearly what I did. The decision to speak on Rome 2 is on me, and I can only apologize for it. If you were disappointed by the game and felt like I misled you, I am really sorry. I got it wrong, and I paid a heavy price and learned some hard lessons as a result. I hope this statement can go some way towards making it right. Rome 2 was grossly mismanaged. The truth is that the Total War team was dysfunctional even at the best of times. And when I sat down to give my rally point interview, I knew there were serious problems with the way the team operated, and it would take a lot of hard work and a lot of overtime to get the game done. Julian goes on to mention that with a good team and better management, they could have actually salvaged this game. However, it was pretty much doomed from the start, with so many features and having ideas and putting them in the game, but with not enough time to actually get it done. But one important part is saying that they weren't able to get it finished because serious mistakes were made. Let's take a good example of this, and this is the expansion of cities. In Shogun, there were several sizes and variants for each cities. This meant that you could upgrade your city on the campaign map, and on the battlefield, that city would become bigger, easier to defend with higher walls, so on and so forth, the main staple of a lot of the Total War games. But for most of the development of Rome 2, however, there was only going to be one map. So regardless of any campaign side upgrades, you'd see the same map every time you fought on the battlefield in that city. Julian says he doesn't know the reason for that decision. His guess is that it was decided it would be better to have fewer maps but spend more time on them rather than creating larger numbers with less detail. I don't know. Once again, that doesn't seem to make that much more sense since, Rome 2 is supposedly a much bigger game than Shogun. So why they'd strip back on features, who knows? But this just speaks volumes, and Julian mentions this, that the way games are developed is either they go the route of polishing a small feature-full title, then add extra features on top of it, or do what Creative Assembly did with Rome 2. Get very overconfident, have huge expectations, and want as many features piled in there as possible without them having any chance of working properly yet. Very unpolished, but wide. And one of the more important ones in this case, the Siege AI. In Rome 2's campaign, the city would grow as it was upgraded and its population increased, taking up more and more tiles on the campaign map. And we can see this in the experience that we've had. Unfortunately, it seems like the battle and campaign design teams weren't communicating these changes to each other, and neither was aware what the other team was doing. Apparently, there was a huge panic when they realized that they wanted the cities on the campaign map to expand, but not really any changes on the battlefield themselves. It created this mismatch, and it all came from a lack of communication. The last few months before release, that was then brought to their attention, and of course, there was panic. This is the perfect case of a feature that was promised, but no one had actually found a way of making it work yet. Instead of delaying the feature, then releasing it later on when it was polished, or even delaying the game as a whole, the decision was made to rush this huge amount of content within the game, therefore quadrupling the amount of workload on the level design in the last couple months before launch. Because of this mismatch between the expansion of cities on the world map but not the battlefield to try and then equalize them, well, it caused so many issues with pathfinding, and more importantly, they were riddled with bugs. And this this is revealing why one of the main issues and bugs within Rome 2 actually happened. Players could interact with the battle maps mostly fine, but the AI was unable to do basic operations like pathfinding. They couldn't issue move orders even when its higher level logic correctly identified what it needs to do. And I guess that explains these kinds of videos.
Do stupid ass things like this.
Here we go. There they come. Oh my god. Oh no. Just kidding. We wanted to knock down that fence. Here we go. Nope.
In short, essentially the AI had only been coded to work on one size of map. So when larger battles were fought, the pathfinding just completely broke. Total War's leaders seemed to resent critical feedback and treated it as unwelcome. It was common for important decisions to be already treated as final by the time that they were communicated to those of us in the trenches, if they were communicated to us at all, as there was no formal process for sharing feedback on creative or management decisions during development. That to me is crazy, by the way. Imagine not having a formal process for going back and forth on issues of whether you can make some of these creative ideas actually work. Julian goes on to say that designers called all the shots. Yes, the designers, and the programming team had very little to no sway in the development process or what things were changed, which is fine when it comes to your big ideas. You know, you can do all these things, guys, but when it actually comes to people saying, actually, this is not possible in our time frame, the designers have already said, we've decided on this, so you're going to make it work. Designers routinely made decisions on intuition instead of empirical observation, rarely opting to test or prototype ideas before pushing them into production. Decisions that should have been given careful thought sometimes appeared to be chosen spontaneously in mid-conversation. And when those of us in the wider team asked basic questions about the motivation or rationale behind a design choice, we rarely got convincing or reassuring answers when we were given answers at all. This brings us on to one of the biggest features that was added into Rome 2, and this was the combination of land and naval battles. Now, the battle programming team actually warns them that the code base will require a lot of code to be changed, and it will create so many bugs if it was possible at all. The leadership said, do it anyway. So, that's when the big Carthaginian siege trailer dropped that demonstrated this amphibious assault, which meant this was now a feature that was being promised. And as we'll get onto later, that Carthaginian assault wasn't within a playable game. It was just one scripted event. The game was then shipped with combined battles riddled with bugs. Julian says that when you see ships going through the land in the initial launch of the game, of course, everybody blames the programmers, saying, what are they doing? They don't know how to make a game. But this is what they were told to do. They'd already said it wasn't possible for them to put this feature within the game in the time frame they were forced to do it, but leadership made them release it in that state. There is a lot on the overload of features here. The full article will be linked down below, but one of the main things it talks about is the capture points on land. Total War leaderships point for these flags on every single battle played to simulate supply trains being cut off by armies and, well, mostly to stop corner camping. This was a huge feature that people hated because you could win a battle with a small army just by camping a flag on the battle map. It completely ruins the way tactics worked within Total War. Julian allegedly had told them it was a bad idea. Leadership ignored him. When the community gave backlash upon hearing about this feature, the Total War leadership allegedly denied they wanted it ever in the first place, showing a complete lack of accountability. Then we have a small bit about the speeches. You know, some of the best parts about battles in Rome and medieval. At the start of a battle where they have a speech to their army that relates to who they were fighting, and it was incredible. Apparently, these were cut because of the voice acting budget. Okay, that might be a point, but this game was huge, with a huge budget. Not to mention, as much as I loved them, the voice actors in Rome 1 and Medieval 2, it's not Brian Blessed. They weren't spending that much money on those voice actors. Have you heard the voice crack Roman, man? He can't have been getting paid more than a few company dinners to do those voice lines. Come on, man.
Many times I have faced this enemy, and many times I have beaten them. Today, when we win, this victory will be yours as much as mine. And remember, they may have the moon people on their side, but we have lovely hats. Those hats will shield us from their fearsome gaze.
There is a little funny bit in here that I like. You know that bit where you can press insert on any unit on Rome 2, and then you can zoom in and you follow that troop to see how they're fighting? It's a cool little cinematic feature. Well, nobody was using it at the start because, let's be honest, if you're actually trying to win a battle, why would you? It's a cinematic camera. Yet the leadership at Creative Assembly wanted to make people use it, so they applied a buff to the unit that you were viewing to make people use the feature more. Yet the programmers apparently didn't like that because, you know, a camera angle that could dictate the fighting strength of a unit seemed stupid. So leadership compromised. And the button did not in fact do anything, but the players would be told it buffed the troop that they were viewing, just so they used it more. Okay, that's not 100% confirmed, and we don't know if that's still a feature in the game, but I almost want that just to be true, out of respect to the commitment to lie, just to get the players to use some stupid camera angle feature that you want in your game. I love it. I actually love it. Do you know this demo, the Siege of Carthage, one of the most infamous? Also, Teutoburg Forest. That was also shown off before the game released. These were all vertical slices. What this means is a small part of the game was feature-rich, but according to Julian at the time, the rest of the game was unplayable. They'd worked very hard on a very small portion of the game just to show it off when the rest of the game, you know, wasn't there yet. And this is nothing new. This is something that's been used in the industry for years. It's not necessarily a good idea in many ways, but it's not groundbreaking. Yet it was the state of the game at the time of these promotional videos. You know this huge battle of Carthage? The game was not even close to being in a playable state at that point, and it was not heading in the direction that it needed to be. It was still many months before basic features would become playable. We were managing to produce something that looked like polished gameplay, something that could only be done by faking a lot of it. It should not have been shown to the public. Let's talk about that famous Siege of Carthage demo, though, that was shown off as gameplay. Apparently there was no AI within this. All of the enemy units were scripted. Lots of parts of the game were only partly working at that point. Things like the siege towers and disembarkation from ships were demonstrated as working, but would still need a lot of work over the course of the project. A lot of the cool moments as well, like artillery hitting the walls, buildings collapsing, elephants charging through dust clouds, were all scripted, not by AI. Cool moments where the commander issued a speech to his men or shout commands to the troops before engaging the enemy, all scripted, once again, not part of the game. Even if everything in that demo had fully represented what the Carthaginian siege battle that we'd end up getting, it was not representative of the state of Rome 2 at that time. But even then, it was one of the most groundbreaking bits of gameplay that we'd ever seen at the time, and it caused a lot of hype. And I think the naive part of us maybe hopes that that's what the real game would be, but as soon as it launched, I think it was very clear that back then, when the Siege of Carthage gameplay was shown, it was not even close to being represented of where Rome 2 was at the time or where it would be on release. The article goes on to talk about a few other things, with the game being patched, and admittedly, I think, for me personally, I love the title at this point in time. I think it's really solid and one of the best Total War games because of the work that's been put into it. Yet with Emperor Edition, many of the leads at Creative Assembly apparently considered the game to be finished. It does feel that way now, but back then, it definitely wasn't. It was down to the programmers that fixed that game, that pushed for patches and pushed for it to be the game that they wanted to release. Yet because of the great sales, a lot of the leads at Creative Assembly took many of the programmers and team members off it before they'd finished patching it. Attila was also plagued with similar issues, and that also came down to apparent leadership not taking into account the worries of people actually working on the game. In the final part of this post, Julian says, "A lot of the players and commentators have voiced strong criticisms of the company over the years, but I think behind the scenes reality of the Total War team was, at least in some ways, worse than even its harshest critics would have imagined." Which is, to me, absolutely crazy to think about. Once again, this is the blog post of one person, an ex-developer that worked there that clearly had a bad time, and they even say, Julian himself, that it was an extreme example of the negative parts of his time working at Creative Assembly. Whether the company is really like this for everyone there, I don't know. But the way that the franchise has gone so far really indicates towards this leadership being the main problem. There's so many talented people working at Creative Assembly with so much passion, and granted they have taken some time off to reconsider, and it seems like what we're going to be getting next will be a thoughtful reintroduction to the franchise, or at least that's what we can hope. Rome 2 was a complete disaster, and I'm glad we finally get some insight into how and why. I don't think any of this will come as a surprise, but just confirmation of what people already knew. But I'd love to hear what you think. Once again, click the link in the description to go and check out the full article. I've just brought out the most important parts and things that were most interesting to me, but I've tried to summarize it in the best way possible. But I definitely recommend you guys going and doing your own reading. Thank you so much to Julian for releasing this. I think it's a very interesting insight to the development and creative assembly as a whole. But until then, I will see you in the next one.